The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. And now introducing 2023 Sine Fellow, Terence Samuel.
This is our series with our fellow Terence Samuel, who's the vice president at National Public Radio at NPR, but he has had a long history in journalism, both local and at the national level. He is going to be talking about issues around local news and the breakdown of local news. But we're really honored not only to have you here and join us, Terry, but also because you are the first one to go, which is never the easiest part. But I just want to encourage everybody, this is the first in Terry's seminar series. There's lots of information at the desk outside for you to learn more about what's happening. We're so glad that you can join us. We're going to get the conversation started and get your questions ready so that we can start going. So, ladies and gentlemen, Terence Samuel, welcome.
Thank you. You guys look great, by the way. Thank you. So I'm really excited to be here, in part because this is not just some kind of abstract issue for me. This really is essentially my life and my life's work. And in addition to the fact that essentially I paid my rent and my mortgage over the years by working for newspapers, I think it is, luckily for me, I found my way to the right place a long time ago. And it was by accident. I was a student at the City College of New York, and I wanted to be on the radio. It took 30 years, but it actually happened. It happened. And I went looking for the radio station, and in the student union, I couldn't find it. So I poked my head into the office and I said, "Do you know where the radio station is?" And the person inside said, "Why? What do you?" I was like, "I want to be a reporter." And he pulled me in and he closed the door. And 2 hours later, I walked out with 2 assignments. A week later, I had my first byline, and it's been downhill ever since. But what we're going to talk about today is what a lot of people are talking about, which is what is happening in local news. What is it doing to our democracy, and why is it important? Let me tell you why I think it's important. There is a quote from Joan Didion, and she says, "We tell ourselves stories in order to live." And it's like this great line, it's this nice sentence. But it is, in fact, true in a very fundamental way, not just for individuals, but I think for communities and cultures. And the stories we tell are as important as the air we breathe, or, I mean, you think climate change is bad. This is equally dangerous. I promise you a great conversation, but I promise you an even better guest. Sarabeth Berman is CEO of the American Journalism Project. A simple name that says so much. And something happens in this town. Practically everybody you talk to turns out to be friends forever. Well, I only met her 2 days ago. And she knows so much and cares so much about this that I tell people all the time that the way I've done this job for so long is I essentially find people who are interested and enthusiastic about something. And even though you have no interest and you don't care about it, you just kind of feed off their enthusiasm. Well, that was that. That's what happened. And so why don't you talk a little bit about, Sarabeth, why don't you talk a little bit about your path to this and why you think it's important, and then we can chat a little more.
Great.
Hi, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. How cool is this? This is an incredible group of fellows you all are going to get to hear from through this series. I am really happy to be here. I really actually want to be in the interviewer seat because we need to hear more about his career in local newsrooms, which I think really brings to life the topic that we are focused on today. I want to pull up a little bit to the kind of macro dynamics that are playing out right now in this country. So over the last 2 decades, we have watched this kind of slow motion decline of newspapers across America. There are now 1,800 communities across the country that have 0 local news. And even communities that still have a newspaper, we have lost so many reporters that they are struggling to provide the kind of basic information and value that newspapers used to play. And I think it can be easy from afar to see this dynamic and think, this is what happens when the internet emerges. You know, I remember the days where we used to have to go to video stores to rent videos. Now, of course, we don't need to do that. And that's been good for all of us. It's much better being able to go to Netflix. This is one of those things that has been fundamentally disrupted by the internet that has actually turned out to have really dire implications on our communities and on our democracy. And there is very, very clear evidence that this is the case. So when we talk about newspapers, we're talking about, you know, the things that showed up on your doorstep every day. But what we're really talking about are a newsroom full of reporters who were showing up at school board meetings and showing up at City Hall and trying to understand what's happening with that property over there that's been abandoned for a while. Why is that happening? And putting all that's happening around in your community into context for you. And those people don't exist anymore in many communities. And the data is pretty clear on this. So in communities that have lost a local paper, we see civic engagement decline, meaning people are less likely to run for office. They're less likely to vote. It makes sense. If you don't know what's going on, why would you vote? If you don't know who the people who are running, why would you vote? There's also really clear data that shows that government spending goes up. So if you're not actually tracking people on, you know, showing up at those meetings and saying, like, why are you spending this money there? And why is that decision happening there? It actually does have implications. People will spend less money, there's less accountability. They'll spend more money, there's less accountability. There's also really interesting data that plays into something that I think we're all very focused on these days, which is that shows that communities that have lost a local paper are much more polarized. And so how do they show this? One is people are less likely to split their ticket, meaning we used to vote locally on the issues. Frankly, if you're mayor, if you wanted them, you know, you would vote for the mayor on the issues. You would vote for the school board member on the issues. You didn't really care, are they Republican or the Democrat? You just want to know, like, how are they going to deal with your trash collection? That's what you want to know. Now, in communities that have lost local paper, we see that people they're just making decisions right down the ticket. You know, okay, are you red? Are you blue? Are you on my team? Are you not? The other thing that's really interesting is there's these political scientists that used survey tools. So they basically surveyed people to look at their mindsets around polarization. Questions like, how would you feel if your daughter married someone from the other team? They're Democrats or Republicans. How'd you feel? And what they found was that in communities without local paper, people's mindsets were more polarized. So why? a few reasons. One is if you don't have local news, what you watch is national news, and our national dialogue is very polarizing. You're all of a sudden in New Hampshire and you're focused on what's happening with the wall down on the border, which frankly has absolutely nothing to do with your day-to-day life. You should not be worried about that issue. There are plenty of issues in New Hampshire you should be worried about. But instead, you're talking about the wall because that's what you're watching on TV. That's what's coming in. The other is that the rise of the internet, as you all know, or I'm sure are very aware of these dynamics, has accelerated the spread of disinformation. And so where you used to go to your newspaper, you now go on the internet and it's hard to figure out, you go onto your neighborhood website and all of a sudden people are claiming things that have happened and you don't have reporters vetting facts, putting things in context, helping you understand what's happening. So all of those things have made people more polarized. So for this reason, we are very, very concerned about the decline of local news across the country. And I can spend more time talking about what we're doing to solve it, but I can stop there for a moment.
And we will. So I told her one story about when I worked at the Roanoke Times and how much it shaped kind of my worldview of how we should conduct ourselves. I got out of college in New York City and moved to a small newspaper in far southwest Virginia. I thought I was going to die. And they literally handed me a county that said, go cover it. This county was Bedford County, Virginia, now famous for having, the World War II memorial. When I got there, everybody talked about the three brothers who died on D-Day. It was a big part of this community. And it became my county. I knew what they cared about. I spent a lot of time there. And I covered some really nasty fights. But here's what they were about. The city school board had a contract with the county for 30 years. And somebody said, this contract is terrible, we should get rid of it. Huge argument about who was going to fund it, how it's going to fund it. How would you actually build new schools in the city to replace the ones that exist if you actually tore up the contract? Completely legitimate fiscal debate. At some point, I'm talking to somebody and they said, if they break up the schools, the football team at the county high school, which contended every year for the state championship, would not be as competitive. So I wrote that story. Changed the debate. Instead of like 15 or 20 people in to discuss the pricing of the contract or the fiscal fallout from cancellation, 300 people in the room yelling and screaming about what happens. And it was because I tell people, once you know what people care about, they were talking to each other. They were talking to the people on the stage, but they were talking across the room. How could you even possibly think about breaking up this high school? And that's what local news is. Some of those people were Republicans, some of them were Democrats. They didn't care. If you were on the other side of the high school, of the football team debate, it was a whole different view. I covered a city council meeting where they were replacing the computers, or thinking about replacing the computers. These are a lot of contract stories.
It turns out in local news, all you ever talk about is budgets. There's a lot of budgets.
And on the other end of the budget is a person who was really mad about something. So somebody puts in a bid to replace the city's computer system. I'm covering it. It's boring. It's like, this meeting should be over. The city attorney at one point just said, I recommend against signing this contract. We don't know what's in this. It's like a pig in a pork. And I heard pig in a pork. And I write it, and somebody let it into the newspaper. So I see him in the supermarket the next day, and he just doubles over laughing. I was like, what's the deal? He said, what I said was pig in a poke, which is apparently a common phrase. It means that you have a pig in a sack and you can't see what it is, so you don't buy it. Humiliating. Humiliating. But that's the thing about being a local reporter. You get instant feedback. And you know, I mean, you're not writing about the State of the Union or the debt ceiling or or how the president handled the Chinese balloon. It's things really close to people's lives. So I haven't interviewed either of the last two presidents. Thank God. Because I just don't do that kind of work anymore. But, Barack Obama, George Bush, Bill Clinton, people ask me all the time, what's the highlight of your career? I was like, well, I met Nelson Mandela one day and he said, have we met? I was like, have we met? He was in jail for like, what are you talking about? So it feels like I've done a lot of stuff. I wrote a book on the Senate, and it's like, how does that happen? But the story, I think, that kind of convinced me about that I wanted to do this kind of work. I'm the night police reporter in Roanoke, I don't know, 150 years ago. And something comes across the radio, and it is double murder, murder-suicide. I write it up. Over the next couple of days, the story comes out. 74-year-old man shoots his 90-year-old mother because he is her only caretaker, and he has been diagnosed with cancer, and he doesn't know who's going to take care of her. I was like, wow. I go to the funeral a few days later. Bath County, Virginia. I looked it up today. 2.5% Black. Guess what? Black family. I was like, yes, I'm in. Some of the DC cousins hate it. What are you doing here? Why are you intruding? But I'm in the church, and in the eulogy, one of the sisters says, I know a lot of you think this is a tragedy, but it is in fact a love story. I was like, wow, that's my kicker. I'm going to talk to you. So I go talk to her, and she's like, come back to the house. I eat food. I see the room where it happens. I talk to the family. I got everything I need. And I say, do you have a picture I could borrow? And they're like, no, only that wedding picture on the wall. And I take my shoes off, and I climb on the couch, and I take the picture off the wall. I'm not feeling great about this, but I'm doing it anyway. And I put it in a garbage bag, and I drive off. And I write a story. Being forward here would remember this because he once worked at the LA Times, and the Sunday paper was a big deal. So late on Friday, I'm still writing. I mean, this is going to be beautiful, and it's on the front page of the Sunday paper. Big splash. A tale well told. A few weeks later, I take the photograph back. And one of the relatives says to me, this was a really hard thing to talk to our friends and family about, but we sent them your story, and that made it easier. And I was like, oh, so it's like that? Okay, I'm in. And that's, the stories are just about people, and they need them. And if you do it right, those become the important ones, as opposed to in 2011, 3 hours before the President Obama gave his State of the Union address, one of my reporters got a copy of it. And we published it, the whole thing. They were furious. That was a fun day too, but not as important as making it easier for somebody to explain that kind of grief to their relatives. That's what local reporting does. It helps you talk to your neighbors. It helps you understand your community. It helps you understand that you are a community. So anyway, that's what we're losing.
I think that story brings to life the kind of data that I was talking about around polarization. Like we have in so many parts of our country sort of a crisis of empathy where we aren't seeing each other as people. And it is through storytelling and the role that local news can play that we can begin to build that back, because that is how you know about your neighbors. That is how you know about what the real story is behind this, double murder. I mentioned this to you yesterday when we were having lunch 2 days ago, but there was a study that came out last year in Palm Springs, California, which I think kind of brings to life how kind of a collection of stories can really move people's mindsets. There was this study that came out that looked at a newspaper called the Desert Sun, which had made the decision to stop running any national opinion stories. So they were only going to write local stories. They had, meaning you were not going to hear opinions about what people think about the president or what people think about national policy. They were only going to run opinions about what people think about local issues. And they did this over a month-long period. And the same researchers that I described that looked at the mindsets around polarization, they came and studied this because political scientists get very excited about real life experiments. So they came and studied the readers and the communities before, during, and after this month. And they studied another paper 20 minutes away, another community 20 minutes away that had not done this. And they found that the act of taking people away from national issues and bringing them down to local issues actually had statistically measurable impact on people's mindsets around polarization. So like if you spend more time reading about the issues that are local to you, you actually will become more empathetic to each other, less polarized, more seeing each other as people and not as teams. So I think that's pretty compelling evidence that the story that you had, it takes, has community level and really national level impact.
I mean, what you're describing, all of those places, those papers on that slide. Sadly, I worked at all of those. I was an intern at the Village Voice, but the headline you don't see under those two pictures is Like Father, Like Son, and that is Donald Trump and his dad.
Yeah.
For New York City in the 80s, was it the 80s? That was a local story.
Yeah.
I mean, the Philadelphia Daily News, my first job, where I interned out of college, the people who wrote headlines in that newspaper had the best jobs. Yeah. I mean, you cannot get any more local than 17 engine as flush grabs Charlie. And you notice it didn't say many engine. It said 17. Everybody in Philadelphia knows that a bus and a trolley hit each other and how many people died. I mean, you can have a conversation about that because there it is. The other one, we win. This is a hugely famous and hugely controversial headline. This is when the Phillies won the World Series in 2008, I guess. But before that, the last time they won, the question was, and there were two front pages made up. One said, Phils win, and one says, we win. And the argument was, do we say we? Do we, the Philadelphia Daily News, take sides and say we win, or do we just report that the home team won? And huge argument back and forth. And Zach Spellberg, the editor of the paper, tired of the argument. Here comes the guy cleaning the floor, pulls it up, and he's like, well, what's the janitor gonna say? We win, because it's your town, it's your paper, it's your city. And that paper, which like to bill itself as the people paper, they kind of embraced it, as you see.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing. These papers, outlets, were so much a part of the community. It wasn't the media.
Yeah.
It was the Daily News, or the Inquirer, or the Bulletin, or the LA Times. I mean, or the Times. And being not just some institution, but a part of the communities, I think, made all the difference in the world.
Your story about running into your subject and him correcting you on the spot, I think is evidence of this point, which is sort of how you build trust with the media. As we all know, people really don't trust the media. The data is clear that we actually do have all-time low trust in the media. People really don't trust the media. And I think the only path to rebuilding trust is because we're humans and we build trust through relationships, through knowing people. Running into someone in the supermarket and he can laugh at you, but he doesn't think you're the devil because you made that mistake. Whereas when you don't know this person, it's just someone abstract that is terrible.
Well, he knew it was a mistake.
Yeah.
And could process that as what it is. Now, if I made too many of those,
Yeah, right.
I wouldn't have a job. But the thing you had to do to counter that is to make sure that a lot of the stories you told, I mean, you tell stories about people you see every day. They have to be right. They got to be right. And it's the little details that make all the difference in the world. I knew it was time for me to leave Bedford County, Virginia, when I went to interview a guy in this little town. He was 99 years old, and somebody said, if you're going to write about this little town, you got to talk to this guy. He's been here his whole life. And so I asked a bunch of questions, and he's got great stories. But my questions come from having, one, been there a little while, a little bit of research, and it was probably some story that I dreamed up and was interested in. And after a little while, it says, so you must be from around here. I was like, hell no. But that's what local news is. It's the chance. Somebody told me this about radio a long time ago, but it really is kind of the crux of what we should be doing all the time. People need to see themselves reflected, and they want to be able to tell their stories in their own voices. And if you could just do that, really hard is when you're covering politics, because that's just a whole different ballgame. But people's lives are not politics. Talk a little bit about the American Journalism Project and how you and your colleagues across the country are trying to rebuild all the things that we're talking about having collapsed.
So I described this downward trajectory over the last 2 decades, and these images, I think, bring it to life. Some of those papers don't exist. Some of them are very, very diminished. But this happened because of a market failure. The internet emerged, and the business model that used to fund journalism was that we would sell ads against you'd have a bunch of salespeople. They'd go out there, they'd get the local stores to advertise in the paper, and that would pay for the journalism. And then the internet emerged, and there was a much better way to advertise. So the advertisers knew there's actually a lot of dynamics. So partially, a lot of those stores disappeared, right? Amazon arrived, the stores no longer exist. And if you were going to advertise, there's a much better way to micro target than to use a local newspaper. You can actually get even more micro by using Instagram to get exactly the people that you want to get in front of. And so because of this, the way that we funded journalism for 150 years disappeared. Yes, you used to subscribe to the newspaper, but that really didn't cover very much of the cost. It was about 20% of the cost. So this market failure means, and the reason why we call it a market failure is because we know that our democracy needs this, but the market's failing to provide it for us. So we in this country have a way to deal with market failures. One is we use public dollars. That's how we fund the roads and the trash. And the other is we've created a tax system that has a lot of philanthropy. A lot of people in this country have philanthropic dollars. There are institutions, there's billions of dollars of philanthropy. They've funded the ballet for us. They've funded museums for us. They've funded lots of community institutions that are essential to a thriving community, but they have never funded news. So our perspective is that if we are going to build it, and if we're going to, and we have to, by the way, because I think the democracy can't function if we don't, but if we are going to build back local news, then we have to figure out how to finance it. And so what we have done is work to help build a new model for providing this service of local journalism through nonprofit news organizations. So these are news organizations that are, for the most part, no longer papers. They're online, although they're often co-publishing with the papers that still exist, and are raising philanthropic dollars. They're going to the community foundations. They're going to individuals. They're asking them to give. They're saying, give to this paper, not just because you need to read it, not just because you need a subscription, but because you know that our community needs this. We win if you have it. And there is still some advertising dollars out there. So they're going, trying to get the advertising dollars where they exist. And they're being really creative about other ways to finance it. And we are part of trying to build a new generation of news organizations across the country that play the role that newspapers played, but look different. This started to emerge over the last decade kind of organically. A lot of reporters were laid off. They still wanted to do the work. They went and they raised a little money and made a news organization. And what we've done is go out and raise national philanthropy. So going to people who care about this issue at the national level and are thinking, okay, I'm really concerned about the future of our country. What are the best strategies to try to solve this crisis? And we go to them and say, come invest in local news. And we take those dollars, and we reinvest them in helping to build these nonprofit news organizations. And our focus is actually not on funding the journalism, but on funding the business side of these organizations. So we fund their fundraising teams, their marketing teams, their audience teams, the teams that will help them build sustainable revenue so that they can sustain the news organizations over the long term.
Let's do a little bit let's do the numbers, shall we say?
Sure.
Talk a little bit about how many of these you've done, because it's kind of stunning.
So we've now invested in, when we say invested, they're grants, but we think of them as investments. They're both investments in communities, but they're also investments in helping these organizations become more sustainable. So we look really closely at, are they growing their revenue? And we think of them as investments. It's called venture philanthropy. So we now have 37 organizations in our portfolio and growing, from Puerto Rico to Mississippi to Montana to West Virginia to Oakland and Berkeley, California, all over the country. We have invested about $40 million. We've raised about $100 million to do this effort. So we're running around the country trying to both find organizations that have emerged organically, like this awesome organization in El Paso, Texas called El Paso Matters, which is now the largest newsroom in El Paso. If you want local news in El Paso, you're probably getting it from El Paso Matters. So we're finding existing organizations, and we're also helping to launch new organizations. We have an incubator where we incubate new organizations. Just last year, we launched something called Capital B, which is a news organization that started in Atlanta. It's planning to launch in many other communities, that's focused on local news for Black audiences, founded by a really extraordinary team of journalists. And then we also have been launching new news organizations through a program where we're working with local philanthropy. I'll give you an example, to help launch new news organizations in partnership with local philanthropy. So in Cleveland, where the Cleveland Plain Dealer used to have hundreds of reporters, it has been heavily diminished. The philanthropic community there was looking at this and really concerned about it. And by the way, I'll just go on a tangent for a moment to say, often folks get concerned about this because, if you are concerned about education, for instance, in your community, you very quickly realize, oh gosh, if we don't have if we don't have reporters covering these issues, we can't make any progress on education. So you sort of quickly get to realizing, oh my God, this is really a problem that we don't have any journalists out here. Even just for simple reasons, like we did this cool thing. We want the local journalist to put it in the paper, and you don't have local journalists to tell. So they reached out to us, and this is happening in many communities, where they say, we see that the paper is heavily diminished. We know this is having huge implications on our community. Can you help us figure out what to do about it? And so we have worked with them to essentially, understand what the market looks like, understand what the needs are. What do we do community listening to understand? What do people want from local news? What are the topics they're worried about? What are the issues they want to learn from? And then we basically say, we'll come in, we'll help you build this if you guys invest and you guys help make this a pillar of your philanthropic priorities. And so we've done this in Cleveland, we're doing this in Houston, we're doing this in several markets all over the country. So we're using all of these approaches to try to rebuild local news across the country.
I was going to ask you to talk a little bit about Mississippi.
Oh, yes. So we have funded this fabulous news organization in Mississippi called Mississippi Today. It emerged, I believe it was 2017 it launched. The Clarion Ledger, which many will know, I see some faces nodding, had this pretty storied legacy, important legacy in Mississippi, and now has, and you can't even count the reporters on one hand. I mean, it really doesn't really exist. And several sort of philanthropists and journalists came together to launch this new digital news organization called Mississippi Today, which we've invested in. Some of you may remember in August last year, Jackson, Mississippi had a water crisis where there wasn't potable water. I mean, we live in, the wealthiest country in the world, and we had a city where people could not drink water out of their faucet. And there they were, a full newsroom of people ready to follow this story. They'd been following it. They understood the dynamics that had led to this crisis. They set up text messaging to get messages out to residents about where you could get water, where you could get aid. They were live streaming public meetings about this. They were answering readers' questions about this. They were helping people understand how to see their way out of this crisis. Who should be held accountable for this? And it was in that moment where you realize, like, if they had not been there, where would people have gotten information? So, and this plays out in every community across the country. So we made an investment in them to help them build out their business team. They've grown dramatically as a result. So they have fundraisers out there. They have trying to raise money. They're appealing to audiences for small dollars. You know this well from the NPR world, which pioneered this, right? We all know that campaign, right? Where they ask you, if you listen, donate. People do it. People do it. They want to pay for it.
We depend on listeners like you.
Yeah, we depend on listeners like you.
The water crisis was a big deal, and I want to talk a little bit about kind of why. So the businesses migrated to the internet. So the stores went away and Amazon happened. The advertisers followed. Why did the journalists not follow? But before you do that, you have to tell the really sexy story about Mississippi, the scoop that they had.
Okay. So they're basically they uncovered a really wild set of corruption going on where the former football star Bet Favreau, am I pronouncing his name correctly? You know, because you do radios, you know how to pronounce Bet Favre.
He's also a quarterback.
Yes, it shows my credentials as not a sports watcher. So
the stories even
better. So he had been using welfare funds to channel it towards the creation of a volleyball studio for
a volleyball stadium where his daughter played.
And
it's the kind of thing that happens all the time and nobody ever pays attention except if there is a reporter going, what's
going on?
And that's what happened.
So they tracked this down, they got this scoop. And, it then became national news. The New York Times, which I have to say, I love the New York Times, but they are not very good about crediting other reporters. They did credit Mississippi Today for this story. And they broke the story. They revealed this kind of massive corruption scandal. And it's having real life implications on people's lives. I mean, those stories are so important. They really show that, like, if you follow the story, follow the money, and you can actually change outcomes for your community.
Yes. Tape of him trying to convince the former governor to do this, and the former governor essentially going along. It was just great stuff.
But what's the scarier part about this? What if they hadn't been there? And by the way, there's a lot of communities around this country where they're not there. So there's this quote from David Simon, who wrote The Wire, who says, "There has never been a better time to be a corrupt politician. It's a very good time to be a corrupt politician."
That sounds fair. So one thing that I found interesting in our talking about this was where kind of the model for this came from. I mean, once you talked about kind of what was happening in the education space and how it transferred, I went, but talk a little bit about why, in some ways, the model for this does have some kind of track record.
We have a robust nonprofit sector in this country that's providing really essential services to communities. I was in the education sector before I was in this sector, and there are so many essential nonprofits that are helping to strengthen the education system across this country, and that's just one example. And so there is a model for when you have a public service that people need, that you can fund it without relying on the market to do it. And I think it's become very clear over the last 2 decades that the market's not going to solve this problem on its own. The New York Times has been able to transition to the internet because the New York Times is a global paper. They have an audience, they have a potential audience of the English-speaking world. And
I don't think they even call themselves a paper anymore.
Yeah, they're exactly. And they are able to really capitalize on the thing that the internet provides us, which is scale. but local is inherently not scaled. It used to be that there were just as many reporters at the city hall as there were at the White House. Or maybe there were a few more at the White House, but like it was commensurate. And by the way, the vast majority of our tax dollars, they're spent locally, not nationally. So we have a disproportionate amount of attention on what's happening federally compared to where things affect our lives, where our money is going, the things that are actually going to change our day to day.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, I mean, there's only one White House, and that press corps was whatever it was, but city halls all over the country, you know, state houses. It's just, I mean, part of the problem we have on the journalism end of the problem is that people who are covering these kind of big global, now divisive issues never really covered a city council. They didn't cover a zoning commission. And so all the divisions you understand are political. When in fact, you know, the guy on the zoning commission hates you because you live on that side of the creek. And we know that if you dam the creek, it's going to cost him water. That's why he's mad at you. He doesn't care what your politics are. And those are the kinds of stories that kind of frame the way you think about kind of public life and public service. And I mean, if you've never done that, you don't know. So we should leave time for questions right now. I wanted to talk about one. So the question was why there was a market failure, but why didn't we, the journalists, see this coming?
There's probably a lot of, I mean, there's a lot of.
Feel free to let us off the hook.
Yeah, there's a lot of things at play. One is that journalists in particular have had for a lot of good reasons, a very, very almost religious obsession with spending no time thinking about the business. And this is partly because money pollutes journalism. Like when you are a journalist, you want to be as pure as possible. You do not want to be thinking about where the money comes. You do not want to be thinking about what will that big company care about this story. You just want to be reporting the facts. That's what you want to be focused on. And so journalists have not spent any time thinking about the business. They've been worrying about doing great journalism. And so that's part of the issue. Yep. There's a lot of other dynamics. Now, more than 50% of American dailies are owned by financial institutions whose incentives are to drive profits. I mean, that's why they exist. They exist to drive profits, not to defend our democracy, not to provide information to communities. And so these papers were struggling. They started buying up papers. They often had amazing real estate. They'd sell off the real estate. Then they'd realize, oh gosh, you could cut those journalists and cut those editors, and you could use the AP stories. And the AP is, I think people know what the AP, right? So you could run AP stories instead of running local stories. And a lot of people just hold on to their subscriptions for a while, and you could still milk this for some profits. And that has played out all over the country. So my belief is that is a symptom of the market, of the problem, not the problem in and of itself, although it is very depressing to watch what's happened. So all of these things have led to really a erosion of newspapers across the country.
And if you don't see yourself in the newspaper, you're not going to buy it. If all you're reading is about what the AP is moving from, Washington, New York, you have no interest in. Which is why the places that have understood what local news is? A big part of it, high school sports.
Yeah.
I had a colleague when I was younger said, it's like, why are we doing this story about this wreck? And it's like, nothing happened. He's like, you see all that traffic? Everybody's going to be talking about this tomorrow. They're going to want to know what happened, on which corner, which car it was, what the model was. There's a thing, you can't do this anymore. But if you went to the taillight of any car and you could tell the year, the make and the model. And so there was this thing these reporters would do. It's like 1984 Buick. I was like, how do you know that? They're like,
There was this study that came out that looked at papers across the country and audited their stories and found that on average, newspapers were producing 17% of their stories were actually local. So a lot of these papers that still exist are not actually running local stories anymore.
We're going to take questions, but when I worked for the Philadelphia Inquirer, we were part of the Knight Ridder chain, and in part became something of a wire service. And it'd be great when I look up and I'd see my name on a story in Houston or Dallas, or it's like, that's really cool. I realized that all of that happened when I lived in New York, and they were publishing stories by a reporter living in New York, working for a different paper. And I'm not sure how well served the people in Dallas or Houston were, but it was fun for me. All right, your turn.
Hi, so my name is Margot. I'm a professor of journalism here at the School of Communication, and I have a book coming out.
Better that he applauds.
See if you will.
Yeah, exactly.
So I was shaking my head when you were just speaking about some of the market conditions. I have a book coming out this year, which is a 20-year investigation of private equity investment, hedge fund ownership, and the influence over the chain market, even before the internet disruption.
Yeah. So
I think part of what I'm trying to combat is this myth that it was the internet or that the papers were failing when private equity stepped in. Because, Knight Ridder is a really interesting example that some of these papers that were gutted by private equity and hedge fund were actually quite profitable. But that's not, I'm not here to debate that. But I guess the question is, and I work for a nonprofit newsroom here on campus called the Investigative Reporting Workshop, but there is a part of me that worries that this system of news that we've always had, which has been profitable since the days of Benjamin Franklin, is, if we're not just shifting the wealth around, that we're going to have a system that, because of advertising, made owners very wealthy, now is making private equity firms very wealthy until that cycle ends. And if we now have a system, if relying on philanthropy isn't just a way of kind of moving the deck chairs around on the Titanic. And I worry about that kind of homegrown, local, NPR, $5 here, $50 during the fund drive. And I just wonder about that long-term sustainability. When is it that we let capital be float off from the shore and say, our philanthropy is done, you're now sustainable through other means? And I just, these are the questions that I'm, that's
We're thinking about these too.
I think part of the problem is we, as a society, are not conditioned to pay for this. People are happy to give to NPR, but they feel like, they're paying for exactly what they're getting. And then we love to have those people, because the bigger the audience, the bigger the membership, we can then go to sponsorships and philanthropy and say, this is essential. A lot of people are voting with their cash that they need it. You need to help us do it bigger and better. And
I'll just add, first of all, I'm really looking forward to your book.
Thank you.
and we'll read it with great interest. And I certainly don't mean to let the financial institutions and hedge funds off the hook here. I think they've sowed,
Have any in mind?
What'd you say?
Do you have any in mind?
Right, exactly. In terms of this question, I think we think the mantra is diversify, diversify, diversify. We need as diversified revenue as possible, and that has a lot of implications. One is, we did not have a diversified revenue stream for newspapers for 150 years. Most of it came from advertising. So one is we just need more revenue streams. Absolutely, tap into philanthropy, tap into readers, go to them, use the NPR model. It works. Get them to commit, change mindsets about people's role in supporting this, not as a transaction like you do for Netflix, but because you want to support your local community institution, as we do so many others. Do go and mine whatever advertising dollars still exist. As you say, there are still some papers that are profitable, although the trend lines are still quite just distressing. But do go mine, get that. And then also within each one of those revenue streams, get as many philanthropists as possible. We do not want to fund this with 5 billionaires. That is not, no one thinks that we should rebuild local news like just with a few people trying to finance this. We need really a movement of people that are funding it. We're about to announce a big project in a state in the middle of the country, and it's and just the founding funders of this is dozens of people coming around and saying we need this. People and institutions saying we need this, and the goal is to grow from there. I spent a while working at an organization called Teach for All, which is related to Teach for America, which some of you may have heard of. Teach for America raises 350, or at its height, it was raising $350 million every year. If we had $350 million going to local news across the country, we would not solve this problem, but we would have a lot more reporters in this country. So that's and that's not funded by one person. That's funded by a whole sector of philanthropy and individuals that have chosen this. So I think of this as a whole sort of movement building exercise that now all of you need to go and spread the gospel around, sharing that if we want a healthy democracy, we need news and information about our communities, and therefore we should support it. So that's how I think about it. The final thing I'll add is that I think that the public treasury should play a role in this. I think we should absolutely, we far underspend on tax dollars on news than other developed democracies. The BBC, most developed democracies spend a lot more money in this space than we do. I think that the public treasury absolutely should be spending dollars to make this work. Journalists are often neuralgic to this idea because the whole idea is you're holding government to account, and then all of a sudden they're paying for your salaries. I think there are ways to structure it that maintain editorial. This is getting rather technical, but there's a whole group of people thinking about how you would structure policy so that it was not just, Jared Kushner doling out checks to the news organizations that he wants to. So there's I think that needs to be part of the revenue pie. So I think the vision of the future is we finance this in a different way. It's not 80% advertising and 20% subscriptions, but it's a revenue pie that looks like we have institutional philanthropy, we have local philanthropy, we have readers giving, we have advertising, and we have some public dollars.
Hi, good to see you. My name is Alyssa. I'm a student. I'm a freshman here at the School of Public Affairs. You talked about, and it was a point that was really poignant to me, is that there's been this crisis of empathy, and how I guess has the movement to social media exacerbated that? Because that's something I've definitely seen in my town, where people are getting their news, I guess, from our local Facebook page that gets really aggressive and things like that.
Yeah.
So has that exacerbated that in any way?
Definitely.
Amazing we didn't get to this.
Yeah.
Definitely. There was this story that covered this community in Pennsylvania where apparently someone got out at the traffic light and was stopped by the police and got out and started, it was carrying a gun and started going through the community. And basically very quickly, people started getting online in the neighborhood Facebook chat and posting about this. And things moved so quickly. And all of a sudden, there was just rampant disinformation spreading around this. And in this community, there was not local reporters who could give any sense of verified information that would help people put in context what was happening. And it sort of brought to life this dynamic that we know happens where we sort of see stories spread quickly and there isn't any good verified factual information out there. I think when you get into the conversation about social media, it is really important to say that local news alone is not a silver bullet. Like there's also a lot that needs to happen in terms of holding the platforms accountable for their own responsibilities in decreasing the spread of misinformation. But we have had these two dynamics happening at the same time, which is that the rise of the internet, the rise of social media, and the decline of local reporting. So we haven't yet played out the experiment of, well, what if you also had local reporters out there in those community chats that people knew and trusted? Also, not in the newspaper, but in that chat, which is where these digital news organizations are. Like they're all there too, in that same information cycle, trying to bring context, bring fact checking. I think that would be incredibly powerful. The other thing I'll just note on this topic, lost my train of thought, but I think
No, I mean, part of the problem is the platforms have monetized bad information, and we have not been able to monetize good information. And frankly, we're just getting our clocks free.
So I'm in transfer, so I'm speaking to a different college's experience, where my former college's newspaper was very underfunded. The administration had a heavy hand in what we published. So I was just wondering if you've seen this on the collegiate level. We particularly had a few incidents that happened in the past semester and last year. And there was a lot of disinformation across like different social media apps like Yik Yak and Snapchat. And there was no one who was really able to like disseminate the information and like kind of come to a consensus as to what really happened, especially because the newspaper was so underfunded and censored by the school.
I mean, that's the classic model: people in power not wanting to be held accountable and going after the people who would. I mean, I don't know what the experience is here, but that sounds pretty familiar to me. So what happened?
A lot of things, but
Nothing good, apparently.
well, most recently, the president of the school was supposed to speak at a club in Florida called the Everglades Club, which is known for not allowing Jewish people or African American people to be members because she was trying to raise money for the college. And she asked the dean of diversity, equity, and inclusion to write a letter to like make it seem that it was okay for her to do that. And he resigned because of that. And we've had 4 deans in the past 4 years resign because of those kinds of actions.
And that's not been in the newspaper?
Not yet.
What?
Not
That's not underfunded. That's
not in the town or in the school either. But I was just wondering if you've seen this like collegiately with the suppression and the underfunding.
I know that the same dynamics that have funded local papers is often how college papers were also funded. I mean, sometimes they get some subsidies from the universities, but often, they were out there selling ads too. And so I think college papers have been suffering these same dynamics. I'm not following it so closely, but I can imagine that the same dynamics that we're seeing in local communities are playing out with college papers. There is this news organization called Open Campus, which is focused on covering higher education because local higher education, because in a lot of communities, the higher education institution is really,
Big institution.
yeah, it's central to the economy, all of the kind of social dynamics that are playing out in our society are playing out on college campuses, and it's hugely undercovered. I mean, you would be hard pressed to find beat reporters who cover these higher education institutions. So they have started this news organization called Open Campus, which is placing higher ed reporters in local newsrooms across the country to cover these big institutions. So I think there is a recognition that these are institutions that have wield a huge amount of power and need to be covered, and are not well covered. So definitely check that.
It's exactly, I mean, it is exactly the same dynamic. A college campus is a community that
It's a local.
deserves to be covered in almost exactly the same way.
Hi, I'm Nami. I'm a master's degree student from the journalism school. I have read the recent article you wrote for Nieman Lab titled Nonprofit Local News Shows That They Can Scale. And I'm very interested in you mentioned earlier that the American Journalism Project raised $100 million. I'm wondering who are funding these philanthropy money? Like, are they those old familiar faces like Ford Foundation, Knight Foundation, or are there new players coming in to play in the?
So this is what I spend most of my time on, which is trying to expand the pie of people thinking about this issue. We're funded by both. So we're funded by, as you say, the sort of those who follow this world, have been in this space for a long time. The Knight Foundation, which comes from the Knight Ritter family money, it has been funding journalism for a long time. The Ford Foundation, we're funded by Laureen Powell Jobs, who has a big organization called Person Collective. Craig Newmark, who started Craigslist, which is one of the first sort of punches to the news organizations, because we used to fund one of the things that newspapers subsidized their papers with was classifieds, and Craigslist, of course, emerged and nobody used classifieds anymore. And this is such a perfect example of someone who recognizes the value of local news and says, okay, I'm going to fund this philanthropically because I played a role in diminishing this industry. What'd you say? Yeah, exactly. Exactly. I mean, he would argue like, look, this is the trend the internet would have done anyway. So we've got to, that's how he would argue it, but I agree. So that's at the national level, and we're bringing in more and more funders who, like I said, care about our democracy and are finding their way to journalism. So like they started with sort of voter rights or voter participation or election security, et cetera. And then they find their way to realizing, oh God, there's this other layer of our democracy, which is our information ecosystem, and they come to us. So that's one. But then at the local level, we're working with all these funders who are community-based. One thing that's been really fun is a lot of these families and communities used to own the paper. And they really loved their role in upholding a civic institution. And then sort of all these now, multiple owners later, they're so depressed by the state of local news in their community. And so we're recruiting them to fund. There's this whole infrastructure of community foundations across our country. There's hundreds of them. And these are foundations that exist to fund Wichita or make Wichita as great and thriving as it can be. So the Wichita Community Foundation is now funding the Wichita Beacon. And so we spend a lot of time trying to bring new funders into this space. But to that other discussion, I think philanthropy can't do this alone. But at the moment right now, philanthropy has historically can play this really important role in bridging from when the market isn't solving a problem and policy hasn't yet caught up. Philanthropy can play in that space really well. So we think philanthropy, we think there's a real call to action to be for philanthropy to step up in a much bigger way. And I'm excited to report that there seems to be a fair amount of momentum that people are recognizing that.
Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm a sophomore journalism student. I'm just wondering, this is kind of a broad question, so you can tell me if it's too broad, but what should we be doing as like journalism students who are about to like who are in the field or entering the field? Like, what kind of issues should we be thinking about? Like, how do we deal with this landscape that we're entering?
I have a few answers to that question. I'd be really interested in your take too. Do you want to go first?
Maddie needs an internship, so.
Actually, I think we're actually looking to you for the answer to that question. You know, I tell people all the time, I
No pressure.
got into this. I am of an age, as some others here, where basically when I walked into a newsroom, everybody who was established in that newsroom had kind of become a reporter because of Watergate. They had seen kind of the power of being able to do that kind of work. That wasn't me. I was interested in the music. I wanted to write well. I wanted to be around people who were doing it well. What you learn very quickly, though, is that the real value of this is listening to people and what they're concerned about. And literally, that's what we're doing every day, trying to figure out what you guys are concerned about. I mean, it's going to be your world. And success in this is figuring out what your story is. I ask people all the time when I interview them for jobs, what is a Maddie kind of story? What is it that you care about? What is it that you do well? And I don't know, generically, we talk about how much your generation cares about climate change, how much you care about social justice. But that's very generic. If I was doing that story, I would never mention those two words. We'd have a really long conversation, and it would be more detailed than that. So I would say bring your concerns to the table, take them seriously, and force everybody else to do the same.
So my thoughts on this, one is I think it is really important that journalism students are deeply aware of these financial dynamics and the market that they're walking into and the changing business model. I think for a long time, not because they should be despairing that there's no market, more just because I think for a long time, journalists just haven't thought about the business model, and it is important to understand the business model. I think you should be really keeping track of this whole emergent movement of nonprofit news across the country. Really take good note of these organizations, look at opportunities. It is the growth part of the sector. All the news organizations, we have 37 in our portfolio. There are many, many more beyond that are hiring. So go look there. Don't just go to the regular path of, sort of what you understood as the legacy institutions that used to hire. Like really start to look at this new movement. I think that local is still like the place to go and to start your career for all the reasons that you were saying earlier around just like to really, really understand this democracy and this country that you want to cover. It happens locally. So I would just very much encourage you to look at, things like Report for America and this market, this emerging system of new local news organizations as incredible opportunities. So that's my thought right now.
Yeah, local is where you discover your value. It really is. All right. One more.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My name is Sarah. I'm a current freshman. So we didn't talk about this often, throughout the seminar, but you did mention how, especially in terms of national news industry research, is governed by political polarization of political parties, which obviously has the last word on the American public. What role would you say that the political polarization and polarizing rhetoric that comes from national relations has towards local news, and what role do you think it'll have like in the future as well?
I mean, you take this. I think if there is local news, the political rhetoric is not as damaging. If there's not, there's almost no limit to the damage that it does.
I would agree with that.
This is great. Thank you guys for being here. We're going to keep this conversation going for months. Come back anytime. I'm going to call you and bug you all the time now.
Good. I really, really appreciated this, folks. Really good. Thank you for having me.